Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And the first thing we should talk about is that Kant is a very meticulous thinker. When you were reading this piece, it's very possible, perhaps even likely, that you had some trouble reading it because of his language. So the thing about Kant's writing is that it's not bad writing, right? He's not introducing a lot of fluff. He's just writing very, very technically. And the thing about philosophers is that they often seek to have as much information as possible in the absolutely clearest way possible. And almost counterintuitively, in an attempt to be extremely clear and precise, the wording winds up being very confusing because they're trying to be exact. So there's this weird paradoxical thing going on. But I can assure you that Kant's writing is not a reflection of an incoherent ethical system. On the contrary, it's reflective of a very technical ethical system that's logically robust. And the thing about Kant is his ethics are really flowing from this complex metaphysical system that he has. So he had these three major critiques: the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, the critique of judgment. And in the first critique, he sought to delineate the scope of human understanding, cognition, and all that good stuff. And he sought to find out what exactly the relationship was between the human mental apparatuses and reality, right? And how they influence one another and all that good stuff. Now, his ethics is supposed to flow directly from that, right? So he's trying to deduce ethical principles objectively from these basic metaphysical and epistemological principles. And then he has this third critique, which is about art and beauty, which is deduced from both of these things. So it's just these thousands of pages of meticulous thinking and writing. And the joke people always say about Kant is that, he was so particular that you could set your watch by his morning walk every morning, right? Because he was going to do the exact same thing every time. So this little bit of background about Kant the person and his overarching philosophical, let's say, goal should contextualize, I think, our understanding of his ethics. So the first thing you want to note is that in the groundwork, this first section is called Transition from the Common Rational Moral Cognition to Philosophical Moral Cognition. And that right there gives you a little hint at what's going on. Basically, he's going to shift us away from this everyday intuitive idea we have about ethics, about right and wrong, and about morals, into a more logically rigorous and philosophically defensible version of ethics. So, if this struck you as being a little bit different than the way we typically think about morals, you're not alone, right? He's even admitting that, right? This is what we're doing. We're trying to move away from the everyday incorrect way of doing ethics. So how does he do this? What are Kant's ethics? What is his reasoning? Blah, blah, blah. So Kant starts the section by explaining that there are these numerous good qualities that exist. And he includes a couple of examples. He talks about wit, he talks about the power of judgment, he talks about intelligence, he talks about wealth. He says these are all good qualities. However, he says something very interesting. He says if you think about all these qualities, while it's true that they can be used for good, they can also be used for very bad things. So, for example, sure, you can use intelligence to figure out problems, to make things better, to understand reality, but you can also use your intelligence to devise really deceptive systems, right, to make things worse. Similarly, you can use your wit and your wealth for good ends, or you can use them to gain power, right, or something like that. So all of these things can become bad. For this reason, all of those good qualities are good with limitation. In other words, they are not unconditionally good. They could be good, but they can also be bad. Now, there is only, in fact, one good that is good without limitation. And this is the thing that Kant calls goodwill. And we're going to have a long conversation about this. So, here's the thing about goodwill. Unlike judgment, intelligence, wit, wealth, honor, whatever you want to call it, all those things, goodwill cannot be used for bad. It can never become evil. So for that reason, we say it's good without limitation, right? Good without qualification. You don't need to walk back your claims about how goodwill is good. It is unequivocally, objectively, absolutely good, right? All the time. And since goodwill is, in fact, the only thing that's good without qualification or limitation, and let me put that up there so we don't forget. It is actually the condition for the other goods being good. So, in other words, this is the thing that prevents those other things from becoming evil. Goodwill is kind of like the person pushing the lawnmower, and those other qualities of the lawnmower itself. So, goodwill is good without qualification or limitation, and it's a necessary condition for all these other goods, which is very interesting. Now, you might be asking why, right? How can it be that this thing is good without qualification? And we don't even know what it means yet, yeah, right? So bracketing that question about what goodwill is, we have to know some basics about it. And here are the two basics, but the question you might be having is, why is that? What is it that makes those other qualities good conditionally and goodwill good without limit, right? No matter what. And the answer to that is because goodwill is good in itself, right? And that's really the key here. Now, what does it mean for something to be good in itself? Well, to understand that, let's think about what it means for something to be good, not because it's good in itself, but for other reasons. Think about money, think about intelligence, think about all that stuff. Notice how we said it could be good if it produces good results. That's what it means to not be good in itself. The alternative is being good because of the consequences that are produced. So, if we were to make a little chart here, this might help explain things. So we have something, right, a quality or an action. And we have the results. Now, what Kant wants to say is that some things are good because of what they produce. However, goodwill is not like that. The thing that makes it good is not merely that it produces good consequences. And this is a very interesting point, because if it's not the presence of good consequences that justifies the goodness of goodwill, that means that goodwill actually, theoretically, could produce consequences that are undesirable. And Kant acknowledges that, because he's not justifying an action conditionally, right? It's not just, oh, is it good? Well, let me see what happened from it. No. It is good merely because it is good in itself, right? And other examples of this might be medicine, right? Or working out. It's like, why is medicine good? Oh, well, because it keeps people healthy, because it keeps people from dying, right? It cures sicknesses. It's good because of its results, right? It's an instrumental good, in other words. And you think about working out, it's the same thing. Well, why is working out good? Well, because it keeps me healthy, right? Helps me lose weight, helps me build muscle, helps me build discipline, right? Become a strong person mentally. So all those things are good because of the consequences they produce. However, goodwill is not good because of the consequences, right? It's good in itself. And this is where things get interesting, because Kant is setting himself up in a way that will later be pushed against by people such as John Stuart Mill and other ethicists, of course. Now, what is goodwill? So far, we only know these vague qualities about it, but we're not quite sure what it is. So we're going to slowly inch through this together. The first thing you want to know is that goodwill is rational. Now, what do we mean by that? We don't mean it's rational in the same way you say, like, oh yeah, that makes sense, that's good, that's rational. He means that goodwill is a product of the faculty of reason, right? Of logical thinking. And if you take this information combined with what we said earlier about goodwill, in theory, being able to produce a bad consequence, you get this seemingly weird notion, or at least a notion that at first seems weird, that reason isn't there to produce good things. And so Kant goes on about this in the writing. He says, many of you guys are going to be tripped up about this because you think happiness is, the ultimate goal, the thing that we should be aiming towards, the thing that a goodwill is supposed to produce, that makes goodwill good, right? Happiness. Reason is supposed to make us happy. And in fact, if you're someone who agrees with someone like Mill, maybe you think that, right? But Kant wants to say, if we're trying to create an ethical philosophy that's purely rational, that's purely mathematical, so to speak, it can have nothing to do with being happy. And he says, let's think about this for a second. And he gives this really interesting kind of like proto-evolutionary justification for why reason's ultimate aim is not happiness. He says, think about all the organs in your body. Think about anything within a system. It's like that thing has developed in such a way so as to benefit the system, right? It develops the qualities necessary for achieving its thing. He says, let's think about reason and happiness. He says, if reason really developed because it bared this necessary relation for happiness, then it would be really good at attaining happiness. He says, that doesn't seem to be the case. And in fact, the opposite seems to be the case, because the more we think about things on a deeper level, the more we logically dissect things, the more complicated reality becomes, the more difficult reality becomes. And the more happiness becomes kind of this unattainable thing, because, hey, if things are more complex, then how am I going to achieve things, right? This is kind of his reasoning. So he says, reason probably isn't suited to obtain happiness because it's not that great at it, right? And there's even an argument for why it does the opposite of happiness, right? And he says this is why humans envy simpler life forms. This is why when you go to a farm, for example, and you look at a bunch of pigs or a bunch of chickens or cows, or even if you look at your dog or cat, you're like, man, I envy them. Their life is so simple. They must be really content. They don't have all these mental complications. They are truly happy. And that's his point, right? And so this indicates that reason isn't about obtaining happiness, and therefore ethics isn't about obtaining happiness. We've just been kind of falsely convinced that is the case for whatever reason, either because it's self-serving, because it's easier to think about, because we like being wishy-washy, whatever the reason. We've been led to believe that ethics is about personal happiness and all these things. And he says, it's not the case. First of all, ethics is not subjective. And Mill would agree, and a lot of ethicists would agree. I mean, and basically anyone who's not a relativist would agree. The relativists are the only ones that say there's some element of subjectivity, for all intents and purposes. Kant's saying ethics is a completely objective pursuit. And so now we have to think about what those objective principles are, right? What are those objective mathematical, so to speak, criteria for judging an action as right or wrong, as moral or immoral? Well, it has to do with this concept of obligation, or this concept of duty. Right? Ethics is all about fulfilling this duty that we have, this obligation that we have. And before you jump to any conclusions, remember, it's not about a duty you have to, like, your brother, or a duty you have to your friend, like, oh, I promised them this thing. It's not exactly like that. It's an obligation we have to something much higher. And so, by the way, this type of ethical system that Kant is creating, the way he's going about it is deontologically. Right? So Kant's ethical system is a form of deontology. And deontology comes from these root words that mean duty or obligation. First thing you should notice, given our previous conversation, this is quite different from consequentialism. Because for someone like Mill, for example, he says things are good because of the happiness they produce, right? So utilitarianism, for example, is one form of consequentialism. Egoism is another, and there's all a bunch of different types. But Kant is not doing consequentialism. In fact, he thinks consequentialist ethical philosophy is misguided. It's not the correct way of doing things, and in all likelihood, that's the reason we don't have common consensus and why we have so many wishy-washy problems and things like that, is because we're not sticking to strict criteria, criteria that are entirely logical. So we have this duty, right? We have this obligation. And if you're wondering, like, okay, but who do I have the obligation to? That's the right question to be asking. So for Kant, he says that we have a duty to this thing he calls the moral law. We have an obligation to follow this moral law. One thing to note, when you see this word law, you might be inclined to think that he's talking about governmental law, right? Civil law. Like, oh, you have to follow the rules or else you go to jail. That's not what he means. Right? Because if he was talking about law, he'd be talking about something out there in the world, right? Something empirical, something consequence-based, and he's trying to avoid all of that. Instead, when he's talking about the moral law, he's talking about some purely rational system that exists. And again, this is an important distinction, because if you misinterpret Kant as saying, oh, you just need to follow the law, you weaken his ethical system, right? He's not saying like, oh, a dictatorship is justified because you have to follow the law. Or, you know, if there are all these oppressive laws that are restricting you and your freedom and your livelihood, like, oh, that's good because you have to follow the law. Not at all what he's talking about. So before we get into exactly what the moral law is, it's important to understand which actions, or which type of actions, let's say, that's more accurate, in relation to the moral law, Kant thinks are good, and which ones he thinks are bad. And then once we've established those different types of actions, we can then delve a bit deeper into what the moral law is, and how this all ultimately relates to a conversation about different types of knowledge that exist. So in the text, Kant makes a distinction between 4 different types of actions. But to make things simpler for our purposes, we can reduce this number down to 3. So there are these 3 different types of acts Some of them are going to be good, maybe, and some of them are going to be bad, maybe. Let's go through them. The first type of action, according to Kant, are acts that go against the moral law. And right off the bat, if you had to guess, you would know that those acts are bad, right? You don't know what the moral law is yet or how it's even established, but you know if Kant's someone who thinks the moral law is important, that an action that goes against that moral law is going to be bad, right? Just very logical. If you're looking for X, not X is going to be bad. Very simple. But then you have all this weird, seemingly gray area, these more complex actions. And this is when you have acts that are in accord with the moral law, but are done for the sake of some benefit. Now, this is an act that, if you zoomed out, it would look like on paper that the person is doing the right thing. However, you find out that their motivation is kind of ulterior, right? They're not doing it because it's the right thing, per se. They're doing it because they get something out of it, either directly, indirectly, either in the short term or in the long term, right? So, for example, the one Kant talks about in the text is, let's say you own a shop. You're a merchant, and you sell to everyone at a fair price. Now, it seems like, oh, that's the right thing to do, right? That's ethical. And Kant is saying, maybe, but maybe not. Because ultimately, if you're keeping a fair price, you're doing this because A, you are going to have return customers, and B, you are going to make more profit in the end, right? So you actually wind up benefiting by creating these equal prices for everyone. And even if you're doing it out of the kindness of your soul, right? You're doing it because I want this person to be happy. That also wouldn't count. Because again, you're thinking about happiness, which means you're thinking about a consequence, right? Things that are done for the sake of some benefit can't work in Kant's system. Because a benefit is a result, and a result is a consequence. So, although there are these actions that sometimes may actually, from a distance, meet the criteria of the moral law, actually are bad because the motivation is incorrect. So then we're left with this third type of act. And these are the pure ones, so to speak. And these are acts that are in accord with the moral law, done for the sake of your duty to the moral law. In other words, you do the action, and not only is the action meet the criteria on paper, but you're also doing it for the right reason. You have this correct motivation because you're not thinking about any potential benefits or potential harms. Rather, you're just thinking about your duty to follow that moral law and doing it for that reason alone. So these wind up being the only acts that are truly moral or have true moral worth, according to Kant. And this is interesting because if this is the case, this means that doing the right thing, behaving morally, sometimes means doing the thing you don't want to do. Doing a thing that actually may produce harm because it's the right thing to do. So it doesn't matter if you hate doing this. It doesn't matter if you grit your teeth and stomp your feet the whole time, or if it's exceedingly difficult. On the contrary, if something is that difficult and you hate doing it, but you do it anyway because it's the right thing to do, that actually shows that you have moral worth. That shows that you respect duty for the moral law and that shows what you're doing is a good thing. That's a good will. A good will is acting in accord with the moral law for the sake of your duty to that moral law. And that's that. And I know that many of you right now will be pushing against this because you're like, wait, this sounds really strict. Kant knows it's very strict, right? Maybe you're thinking, well, this is really hard to do. He says, well, I know it's really hard to do. I'm not saying it's easy. Ethics doesn't have to be easy. And the fact that it's hard just proves even more so that if you do it, there's something praiseworthy, there's something truly moral there. Now, at this point, you got to be wondering, okay, but what is the moral law? Like, how do I know if I'm following it? Where does it come from? How does he even establish this? And that's the right question to be asking. And there's a kind of test that we can do to determine whether something becomes or can become moral law or automatically becomes not part of the moral law. So let's say you're about to do a specific action. Anything you could think of. You want to ask this question. Can this type of action be universalized? What does that mean? Well, if something's universal, this means it's like unilateral, right? It is all-encompassing and applies to everything. So what does it mean for an action to be or to not be universalized? Because at the end of the day, what Kant is going to say is, if no, right, then it's out of whack with the moral law and you shouldn't do it. But if yes, right, then it could be good. But in order to figure out what this means, we have to talk about this concept of universalization. Now, what he means is something like this. Let's say you're about to do something. You want to ask yourself, is it possible for everyone to do this thing all the time? Would this be able to happen? If the answer to that is yes, then maybe you have something good going on. If the answer is no, then you don't. So let's take a simple example like stealing, right? Let's say you believe in general that stealing is bad. However, you need to feed your family and yourself because you're poor, and you think if I steal this little amount of food, that's okay because I'm doing something good and I'm not harming someone if I'm stealing from someone who's, super rich or something like that, maybe you're thinking. Kant is going to say, okay, but what if everyone stole all the time? And he doesn't mean, this is important because I know you're thinking this, he doesn't mean that the world would be chaotic if everyone stole all the time and therefore you shouldn't steal. No. Why can't he mean that? Think about that. He can't mean that because if that was his justification, he'd be a consequentialist. Because he'd be saying this action is unjustified because it would produce bad consequences if universalized. That's not what he's talking about. He's thinking literally, is it logically possible for the concept itself to exist when applied all the time? And so let's think about what that means. In logic, we talk about definitions a lot. And the definition, of course, is not only what something means, but what something is, right? An explanation of what something is. And an important concept in definitions in logic is this idea of something we call necessary conditions, right? Or qualities that are essential in order for that thing to be, right? So if we think about what stealing is, we would say that it is the wrongful taking of private property, right? You're taking private property that isn't yours. So in order for stealing to exist, private property needs to exist. Very basic, right? If there was no private property, then stealing couldn't exist. But let's think. What if everyone stole all the time? Well, if everyone stole all the time, then that means there would be really no such thing as private property. But wait a second. If there's no such thing as private property, then there can be no such thing as stealing. So it cancels itself out. So it's logically impossible for stealing to exist as a concept if stealing were universalized. Interesting. So there's this element of self-contradiction that happens. Here's another example. Think about what lying is, right? Lying is, and I'll do this in the board, just to make sure we're following. All right, so we say that lying equals something like not telling the truth. So you need a couple of things in order for lying to exist. First of all, you need the truth, right? And then you need a negation of that quality. If you don't have the negation, then you just have truth, in which case there's no lying. And if you just have truth, then you just have a negation that's not attached to anything, in which case it's not lying, it's just nothing, right? It's just a blank negation. So you need both of those things. Sometimes we think lying's okay. Sometimes we think white lies are okay. Sometimes we think if someone comes to you and they say, hey, do I look good? And you're like, I don't know, this person doesn't look good. You're like, okay, but I don't want to hurt that person's feelings, so it's okay to lie. Let's think about it, according to Kant's logic. Well, if everyone lied all the time, then there would be no truth. But wait, if there's no truth to not tell, and so lying can't exist. Therefore, lying is immoral because lying is not able to be universalized. Because if lying were universalized, then truth cannot exist, and therefore lying cannot exist. Therefore, there's this contradictory aspect going on. And that's what Kant means. Can this action be universalized? If the concept defeats itself, even if logically speaking, in theory, the concept can no longer exist, then the action is immoral. It goes against the moral law, and you should not do it. And doing it would be that first type of action, and therefore it would be bad. But if yes, if the action can be universalized, well, then you might have something, and maybe it's capable of being the moral law. Now, stealing and lying are fairly simple ones to think about. And I've had students in the past ask, like, well, what other things wouldn't be able to be universalized? And we have to kind of speculate at this point because we're leaving Kant's exact words, but one that's interesting that might work, or that might also be an example of something that can't be universalized in Kantian logic is pollution, right? Because if you pollute, that means you're dirtying the clean air. So you need clean air in order for pollution to exist. But if everyone pollutes all the time, then there is no clean air to pollute, and so pollution can't exist. So maybe that's a reason why that can't be moral. I don't know. That's just one example. Now, it's easier, I would say, in my experience, to determine what's not moral for Kant. It is much easier to say this act goes against the moral law. It's much harder to determine what is the moral law, because as some students have pointed out in my past classes, there are things that seemingly could be universalized that aren't part of the moral law. And here's a wacky example. Spitting on someone. Spitting on a person, right? Well, if everyone spit on someone all the time, there would be no contradiction. Like, you're not in universalizing the action of spitting, removing the necessary conditions for spitting. No, it seems like spitting on someone could still subsist in theory, but does that mean it's moral? I don't think so, right? That probably isn't a good thing to do. So there needs to be more to it. And one of the last things we could say is that, so Kant has some further reasoning to justify things, which we're not going to get into in this lesson or in this class. But a couple last things to note is that when you're researching Kant's ethics, you might hear this phrase. And the phrase is called categorical imperative. Like if you Google this, if you YouTube this, if you look it up on any of the encyclopedias of philosophy. And Kant explains in a later section of the text that an imperative is a statement of that you should do something, right? It is imperative that this thing happens. And there are different types of imperatives. The first type of imperative is called a hypothetical imperative, which means if you want this thing to happen, then you should do this thing. Then it is imperative for this to happen, right? If you want, the world to be a clean place, then you shouldn't go around throwing your garbage. So that's telling you not to litter, but based on some hypothetical goal that you might want. And obviously Kant's going to say that's not any basis for real ethics because that's based on the consequences, right? And it's conditional. However, there are these other types of imperatives called categorical imperatives. And categorical imperatives are oughts, shoulds, right? Things that should be done, not because of some hypothetical conditional goal you have, but merely by virtue of logic, right? By virtue of the category that the thing is, because it's purely rational to do so. And that's what Kant ethics is based on. Many other ethical systems, such as Mill, are based on hypothetical imperatives. If this thing maximizes happiness, then you should do it, right? Or the egoist might say, if this thing maximizes my happiness, then I'll do it. And Kant's saying, no, we don't focus on hypothetical imperatives, we focus on categorical imperatives. And what this means, because if you recall earlier in the discussion I was talking about how this is ultimately going to relate to types of knowledge, well, we're back to this distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. Right, and just to briefly review, we know that a priori knowledge is empirical, right? Meaning that this is knowledge you gain after empirical verification. For example, I know that it's sunny outside right now because I could look outside, and I know that my senses don't deceive me. I could know that my cup is less than half full because I'm looking at it, right, and I'm drinking it. If I was in a room with no windows and no doors and I had no access to a phone or a TV and hadn't talked to anyone and you told me it was raining, there's no way I could know that, right off the bat, just by thinking about it, because I need some type of empirical verification, right? So but then there are these other types of, this other type of knowledge, which is called a priori knowledge, which if you recall, is purely rational, right? A posteriori knowledge, posterior means after empirical verification. A priori, prior knowledge means not prior knowledge like, oh, I learned this in the past. It means it's knowledge you have before empirical verification, purely rationally, right? So something like 2 + 2 = 4. Now, we know that someone like Mill, the consequentialist, view ethical knowledge as a purely a posteriori pursuit. And Kant disagrees. He thinks that's wrong. He thinks ethics is a purely a priori pursuit, a la math, a la pure logic. Which is why this whole universalization test is merely thinking about the possibility of concepts and what follows from it, and not looking at what happens in the world. Lot to swallow. We can go on forever talking about this, because oftentimes people push back against this because they really hone in on the fact that, oh, maybe the goodwill that's doing the right thing can produce something bad. And yeah, that's true, because if you can't lie or can't steal, it's like, well, what if a murderer comes to your door and asks if anyone's in the house? Do you tell the truth to the murderer And many people who teach Kant will say, yeah, you have to lie to the murderer, right? Because this is Kant's principle, and a lot of people just can't accept that. So either Kant is wrong and ethics is determined by consequences or something else, or Kant is right. And we just have to accept that it's much harder to be a good person, and we have to forego assigning primary value to happiness and instead assign primary value to pure reason. Again, it's hard. He's not saying people are like this. He's saying people should be like this, right? It would be better if people were like this, because ethics isn't about what is. Ethics is about what should be, how we should act, not how we typically act. So, high standards, technical system, difficult to understand, there's a lot to it, but at the end of the day, he's making a pretty solid case, and it's your guys' job to try and unpack that case, to determine if there are any logical errors, or to determine, even if there aren't logical errors, why we should or should not adopt this as a moral framework, right? So, I know it was a lot. We could stop there for today. As always, if you guys have any questions, email me or sign up for office hours, and I will always be there to help. I'll see you around. Have a good day.